There's a new target on the suspect radar, and it's Roaring Moon. The past cousin of Salamence has found itself in the eyes of the overused player base before. When it first got sent to the chopping block, it was banned by a 70% majority vote. However, this took place before the Indigo Disc DLC came out, after which Roaring Moon was allowed back into the OU tier and has remained ever since. It's been able to stay under the radar as powerful threat after powerful threat got banned, but now it's been thrust back under scrutiny of the tier due to its litany of viable sets, some of which have only popped up recently. So, what makes Roaring Moon so contentious? Ever since the start of the generation, its monstrous 139 base attack, coupled with booster energy and Dragon Dance, make it incredibly hard to answer. It can easily find free turns to set up thanks to its great special bulk, and serviceable physical bulk when combined with terrestrialization. The Teal Mask DLC gifted Roaring Moon Knockoff to make it even more challenging to stop. Previously, it was limited to either the suboptimal Crunch or the risky Jaw Lock as Dark-type stab moves. Its great base 119 speed stat also allowed it to outrun many common Choice Scarf and Booster Energy speed users after a Dragon Dance, such as would-be Revenge Killers in Enamorous, Iron Valiant, and Iron Moth. Roaring Moon's good coverage in Acrobatics, Earthquake, and the recently developed Terrablast Fairy make it even harder to subdue, with Terrestrialization powering up these moves to blow past what would ordinarily be a solid check. Suddenly, your Zamazenta drops to a Terra Flying Acrobatics, or your Sticky Barb Clefable gets obliterated by a Terra Ground Earthquake. Roaring Moon's ability to invest into bulk without sacrificing its offensive power is another point of contention. For instance, your low kicks could reliably revenge kill an offensive Roaring Moon with First Impression, but it falls short of OKOing a defense-invested set. Newer experimentation has also yielded dangerous bulky Roost and Taunt sets, often paired with Terrablast Fairy or Terra Ghost, that sacrifice some of Roaring Moon's defensive wall-breaking power for a far more dangerous setup threat. Roost keeps Roaring Moon out of range of priority users like Extreme Speed Dragonite and Scizor, while Taunt allows Roaring Moon to turn otherwise decent defensive checks into setup fodder, such as Tinglu, Moltres, and even Iron Defense Zamazenta if Roaring Moon is Terra Fairy. That's not even mentioning Choice Band Roaring Moon, usually found on Sun teams. The sheer power of Choice Band coupled with Photosynthesis speed allows Roaring Moon to become a nigh unstoppable wall breaker, while still outspeeding the aforementioned threats, all without having to waste a crucial turn to set up a Dragon Dance. And now, let's hear from some council members and other notable OU tier members on what they think of this prehistoric beast.
All right, hello. So for those of you who aren't familiar, my name is Ausma. I am a member of the OU Council. I've been on the council for the entirety of this generation, and with me today, I have two very wonderful players. We have Leng Loi, and then we have SRN. Both have had a very wonderful presence in the latest SPL, and I believe both were also at SEL too, the latest SEL.
SRN, were you in SEL?
Nah, I was just helping like the platoons.
You're definitely in this SPL though, right?
Yeah.
This SPL, yeah, not the last SPL.
Yeah, but anyway, yeah.
He's done pretty good, in my opinion.
Yeah. Would you two like to kind of introduce yourselves?
Sure,
Yeah.
I'll go first. I started playing Pokemon competitively, or at least on Smogon in X and Y. I then took a very, very extended break for many years and took it up rather seriously at the beginning of this generation. And since then, I've made my name on Ladder, and I've made my name in tours a little bit. And I'm here to talk about Roaring Moon.
Hey, some of you guys might be familiar with me, SRN. I think I've joined in like Black and White, maybe DPP. I've been here for a long time, but I've just been chilling in the OU room for like a fresh decade until I decided to start trying this generation. Yeah.
And that's really funny because I remember like seeing you latently back when I was still lurking on the forums, and then I started actually participating more in Gen 8, and then you just disappeared off the face of the earth, and then you just came back.
Yep, that's it.
Regardless, I think we all have a good amount of expertise, or at least 2 cents to give about this issue. That being the current Roaring Moon suspect test, it is proven to be a bit of an issue in the meta, mostly on the back of the emergence, we can say, of bulkier setup sets and various new Terra types that's abusing. And this versatility is, in my opinion, the big nail in the coffin that will likely see it go.
Earlier this generation, a lot of people mostly pigeonholed onto the offensive Roaring Moon sets, just max attack, max speed, and on paper this seemed like it made a lot. On paper, this makes a lot of sense to me, just because its speed tier is really deluxe for a Dragon Dance Pokemon. It outspeeds Iron Valiant, Iron Moth, and it speed ties Cinderace. So it ends up being, it makes sense, very intuitive to run it with like a booster energy, Dragon Dance, 3 attacks. Earlier this generation, we mostly saw it running Crunch, Earthquake, and then Acrobatics, and then it got knockoff in the Teal Mask DLC, which I believe caused it to get banned for a little bit because
It
it was
did
very
get
good.
banned for a little bit, yes.
Yeah, and it was a very strong option for it. However, this SBL, and I'd argue a little bit before that as well,
Mhm.
we've been seeing a lot more innovation with this Pokemon because, as it really turns out, when you have these insane fundamentals and the BST of a pseudo legendary and a very spammable stab move that makes progress, near guaranteed progress, and is extremely strong coming off of your base 137 attack stat, it's very easy to find ways to innovate with this Pokemon, and innovate people have. We've been seeing a lot of different sets recently, including what Leng Loi mentioned, the bulky Dragon Dance set, which is really what catalyzed this suspect test.
Indeed. And that set primarily uses Terra Ground with Earthquake and Roost, in addition to Knock and Dragon Dance, of course. It also can run Terra Blast Fairy instead of Terra Ground and Earthquake. And let's not forget that an initial 3 attack set and the Taunt set as well haven't really gone anywhere. They're certainly less prevalent than the bulky sets, but I don't know that they're necessarily less effective.
I
Yeah,
think they're
and
more
I
preferable.
also think one of the stronger sets that hasn't been mentioned yet is the Terra Ghost Taunt set. Some of the counterplay that has arisen in response to Roaring Moon's, I mean, just prominence in this past SPL season, we're seeing stuff like a lot of Iron Defense Corviknight and especially Unaware Clefable. Those are actually able to check the Terra Ground and Terra Blast Fairy sets pretty well, but they're going to lose to the Taunt Terra Ghost sets, and I mean, they could also lose to Taunt Terra Flying. So
Mhm.
it's getting tough to build around Roaring Moon and account for all of its sets. I mean, like if you want to try and account for everything, that's like Iron Defense Corv, and then if you want to cover Flying and Ghost, maybe you add a King Gambit. That's like 2 slots dedicated to just one Pokemon to cover all possibilities, and
Good synergy on
that's
top of
tough.
that.
Yeah.
Like Roaring Moon can just run knockoff, and one of the things about King Gambit that can be really annoying for it, at least from my experience, is dealing with Rocky Helmets, especially if you want to try using it in like the mid game because of its defensive utility. It can be kind of easy if you use King Gambit in that way to kind of get chipped down. And really having that roaring moon that not only like shores up that problem with its knockoff as well, can be very devastating on top of the fact that they do just have natural defensive and offensive synergy with one another.
Absolutely. We definitely don't need to get into a King Gambit discussion. However, I
No.
think you've hit on something that makes Roaring Moon really unique, and that's that it functions both as a breaker for itself and other Pokemon and as a win condition. It's a little too no consequence to fit onto an offense team, and based on the fact that, it knocks off items to make progress for other physical sweepers, or knocks off boots on things like Dondozo to break stall, for example. Yeah, I was also going to say that it's hard for people have focused on this Pokemon as sort of a anti-fat presence in the metagame or anti-bulky team, but I think it's also really hard to build offense in a way that you're not giving this Pokemon free turns. Because the bulky sets really thrive off of getting a free Dragon Dance because you're not revenging this Pokemon with priority most of the time. It can Terra out of it, and it lives a lot of priority hits. And then you can't rely on just base speed revenge killers because remember, there's not a lot of good Scarfers in this tier.
Yeah, and if you want to rely on booster energy Pokemon, I mean, you're gambling whether your Iron Valiant is going to be faster than that Roaring Moon. If it's a bulky, well, it might be slower, but it might also live an attack. If you have a fast Encore, you could prevent it for one turn, but if it's faster, then you're dead, and yeah, things can go south really, really fast. So
And
it's a struggle for every team style to handle.
and,
You
and that's
also have
assuming.
to you also have to get that Iron Valiant in on
Yeah.
the Roaring Moon, which is offers even more uncertainty. It's just a whole mess to deal with this Pokemon with offense, and we've already established why it's so hard to deal with for bulkier teams as well.
Yeah. And something else on top of that is because, like, as previously mentioned, it really takes advantage of free turns. And talking about like a booster energy Iron Valiant, it doesn't even matter because once it gets, sometimes it doesn't even matter because then if you get to +2 like speed, then like it doesn't even matter. It's faster than you anyway, and it could be potentially curtains at that point if you're running a more offensive team.
This is something that hasn't seen nearly as much usage as the other sets we've ran or mentioned thus far, but Terra Blast Fire is a real set. And, I've seen it on ladder. I think it got brought at least once, SRN. Can you back me up on that, or am I hallucinating?
I have seen I've seen Lumberry Terrablast Fire outrage on the ladder, but I have not seen it in SPL, I don't think.
Okay, I might
Oh,
be misremembering, but I mean that's certainly Terra Blast Fire is an option. There are Terra Blast coverage for this Pokemon, and we really don't need to turn this into a Terra Blast discussion. But I really would implore the council to start looking in that direction.
yeah. I don't think it's any surprise to anybody that I am the world's biggest Terra Blast hater. I will advocate to get that thing suspected until the end of time. But the thing about Terra Blast is that it's definitely a kind of thing that needs to be, I believe, there needs to be a policy discussion around it. I think there needs to be a deeper dialogue with the overall community about the basis on which we discuss it, because I feel like there are a lot of people who misunderstand a lot of the anti-Terra Blast sentiment and sort of the ideas around suspecting it. And obviously, like you mentioned, this is not a Terra Blast discussion, but I do think Terra Blast absolutely is one of the key arbiters toward Roaring Moon being a potentially broken presence, just because it really rounds off its bulkier sets really well.
It also makes it harder to answer in a very hypothetical way as well. I think without Terra Blast, Roaring Moon would likely still be an incredibly oppressive presence in the tier, not necessarily in a broken way, even though that's what all three of us are advocating for, or advocating that it is, because of just Terra Ground Earthquake or Terra Ghost Taunt. These things don't rely on Terra Blast, but this is a bit of a hard segue, but let's talk for just a second about arguments that people have brought up that Roaring Moon is able to be dealt with in a healthy way. The first being related to this is that it's extremely Terra dependent on a lot of teams, especially those Terra Blast versions. Especially if you're running Roost, you only have Knockoff or Earthquake as your attacking move, and that's really hard to play if if you're forced to Terra a different Pokemon.
This is true, though at the same time, I think part of what makes the Terra Blast sets effective is the fact that knockoff is such a self-sufficient move.
Mhm.
It's a very hard move. It's like if there's a move that if there's a type and a move that you could only have one of, it would be Dark and knockoff. And I do think even with Terra Blast, it absolutely can win with the right conditions, but it absolutely is like, and
I
it
might
is that's Terra is definitely a very important tool for it.
Absolutely. I might disagree with you on the knockoff being the most important, at least in Gen 9 OU, or the way it currently stands. I think quite a few knockoff absorbers in Gliscor, Clefable. The tier is kind of built around Dark Resists in a lot of ways. Between Tinglu, the aforementioned Clefable, the best Pokemon in the tier, Zamazenta or Great Tusk, depending on who you ask. These kinds of things, it feels like the tier is built around Dark Resists in a lot of ways.
Right.
It's
That's a good
why
point.
the Darkrai panic didn't last too long. Although Darkrai might not be the best example because it's really thrives on its coverage moves.
Probably King Gambit would be a little bit better.
Maybe, maybe. Although Darkrai does forgo a lot of coverage oftentimes to run Wisp or Knockoff or both or Taunt.
I think Roaring Moon, it's one of those Pokemon that it really it's I think its strongest sets are usually having two attacks. Because
Yeah.
Dragonite is taking up one and Roost or Taunt is taking up another or Sub. Pokemon in general, I find that can have that efficient coverage within just 2 slots and have those other 2 available to do other stuff, they can be pretty effective. And Terra Blast is a really big part of creating that 2 move coverage. I think a big example of that is obviously knockoff Terra Blast Fairy, or in King Gambit's case, Kowtow plus Terra Blast Fairy. Kyurem has Freeze Dry plus Earth Power. Dragonite has Terra Blast Flying plus Earthquake. These are really strong Pokemon, really strong sets because they have those 2 moves that they can lean on, one setup and then one for utility. It's just really a lot more effective, in my opinion, than having to devote 3 of your slots to have sufficient coverage to hit everything.
Yeah, I
That's a
fully
really
agree.
good point.
And I actually think that's probably part of why the Booster Energy 3 attack set, while it's still a very prolific and very potent set, it definitely has been, I think, more reasonably adapted to over the course of the generation.
Certainly been
Um,
overshadowed, yes. So, I mean, I'll start off because I had been thinking about it, but or 2 Pokemon actually, is we mentioned Unaware Clefable earlier, but I think Magikarp Clefable, either with a Rocky Helmet or Sticky Barb, have been really picking up lately. I mean, you see less Sticky Barb, and Clefable is good for other reasons as well, largely a change in the ground types that we're using, so more Ting-Lu, and also the Garg explosion. But I think Clef still really handles Moon quite well in the grand scheme of things. The other Pokemon that I wanted to mention is Scizor. Scizor has a phenomenal win rate in SPL, and I've seen quite a bit of it on ladder as well. And it's just really invaluable counterplay. We mentioned earlier that offense has a really hard time adapting to giving specifically Terra Fairy Moon or Terra Ground Moon as well, but specifically Terra Fairy Moon free turns. When you slap a Scizor on an offense like that, you can kind of get away with using Pokemon like Choice Specs Dragapult or Choice Scarf Golden Go, although that's a hard stack to make, where you're locking yourself into moves that give Roaring Moon setup opportunities.
I think, yeah, priority, especially that can handle Roaring Moon even after it's terrestrialized, is really an important way to try and contain it. I've been using a lot of Rillaboom myself personally, and once you've been able to force the Terra, whether that's Fairy, Ghost, or Ground, a good strong Grassy Glide can help contain and limit its sweep. And other sets, like obviously there's Extreme Speed Dragonite. Now,
Mhm.
you have to be, in all of these cases, you have to be mindful that bulky Roaring Moons, I've seen investments that can range from like, maybe like just a little bit of HP, like 32, all the way over to like max 252 in defense,
I know
140 in
your
HP.
I know your SPL manager is a big fan of max defense.
Oh yeah.
Um, Yeah, I am too. I think one of the sets or the spreads that I really liked earlier in SPL and during my OST run was a spread that, I'll pull up right now, but essentially it's geared towards living Terra Bug Choice Band first impression once you've Terra'd. So it's no longer super effective.
From low kick.
Um, from low kicks, yes.
Yeah.
So that's a really impressive calc on a Pokemon that in the beginning of the generation was infamous for having worse physical bulk than special bulk. People would joke about saying like, you can just extreme speed it.
I do think on like the topic of like strong priority users, I actually really have enjoyed low kicks a lot lately. I think even just aside from Roaring Moon, it's a very strong, like, I think in a lot of ways it can be a very potent anti-meta Pokemon in a way that can also be adapted to, especially if like you're running choice band low kicks with first impression. While that is a very strong option, if you're locked into that, it can even be exploited by like
Roaring
um
Moon, for
yeah,
example.
yeah, exactly. Even by Roaring Moon, especially if you're running a bulkier Roaring Moon, really leaning into that investment, which I think it absolutely can get away with.
I think we definitely saw during SCL and probably not really going into SPL, but the period between the 2 tournaments, a lot of hype for low kicks. And I think that died down for a couple of reasons. I think people found that Petulant, that explosion was really difficult for low kicks because once it's knocked off, you're really not even doing that much with knockoff. And Petulant can also even Terra to get out of it.
I wanted to
But
say we should probably segue because I think all three of us are pro ban Roaring Moon. I'll play devil's
Mhm.
advocate and argue maybe for the other side on maybe why Roaring Moon should stay. So
Mhm.
some of the arguments I've heard of, obviously, alongside like there are some counterplay like Unaware Clef, Magic Guard Clef, Iron Defense Core, Strong Priority, and just in general, it's being reliant on Terra. One of the other
Mhm.
ways that it could be argued that it's healthy for the tier is more emphasis on its sort of wall breaking aspect. Because a
Mhm.
good strong knockoff and its like high immediate power is pretty healthy for the tier. Maybe
It is
it's
also hard to come by in some
yes,
respects.
exactly.
Especially in Pokemon that are not choice locked. We have Scizor, Meowscarada. On the physical side, at least, I think our strong knockoff users are really limited to Scizor, Rillaboom, Meowscarada, Samurott,
We-
and of course
Weavile.
Roaring Moon.
Weavile as well, I think.
Ah, Weavile. How can I forget my favorite Pokemon? In SVOU at least.
I also think Tyranitar actually is a little underrated in that regard too.
I'm gonna have to
Um,
disagree with you there.
I don't know. I think Tyranitar could be kind of the goat sometimes, but like I do agree that it is a little inconsistent compared to the other like options.
Hmm.
I definitely,
Yeah.
but it is a very strong knockoff. Like let's not kid ourselves in that regard.
Nonetheless,
Um,
I agree that having a breaker that offense can default to for knocking off specifically boots, but also other items, is in some ways healthy because it power that we wouldn't otherwise have. I get that. What I would say is I think it's maybe too splashable for reasons that we mentioned earlier, or at least I mentioned earlier, that Brain Moon acts not only as a breaker for itself and others, but also as a win condition, largely off the back of these bulky sets. It's funny that these faster sets, I think a lot of new players see speed boosting setup Pokemon and immediately think that these are, in most matchups, game winning plays. When in reality, Taunt Roaring Moon, which is the most common, I would say, fast Pokemon or fast version of this Pokemon is by far and away more of a breaker than it is a win con.
yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
I would
also
agree.
I also think something else about Roaring Moon that also isn't really talked about a lot, but mostly because booster energy is like the most used, and there's a very good reason for that. But I also think that it actually can get away with some different item slots depending on the team in question. Like I personally really rate like Covert Cloak on Roaring Moon because it actually turns things like Alamomola and even like Pecharunt into setup opportunities depending on like your Terra type and such. But
That for
um,
sure. I think we see a little too much tickle Alamomola for me to, which, by the way, for any less in the know players, I'm not joking when I say that tickle Alamomola is real Roaring Moon counterplay.
yeah,
People run tickle, flip turn, wish, protect, so that when you can just keep tickling and wishing, and eventually its defense is low enough that you can flip turn, deal a good chunk of damage, and revenge it with priority, or typically not a faster Pokemon, typically priority because it's speed boosted at that point.
yeah.
But
So
oftentimes you just force out the Roaring Moon. It's also good into the Wellspring switch in by weakening it for your other Wellspring answers.
yeah,
But
I
yeah,
fully agree. I think Tickle is actually like probably one of its best like options right now. It's a really and it's also just a good way to avoid Alamomola from being set up on in general from like a lot of different Pokemon, while actually helping its while making its flip turn sting a little bit and getting that subsequent priority switch in. Like I've really enjoyed running it with like low kicks especially.
yeah. I think low kicks appreciates without getting we'll veer away from the Alamomola conversation, but low kicks really appreciates the assault vest Alamomolas. But we may be at a low point for low kicks innovation. So that's a good area to look, perhaps.
Yep. I fully agree. I think there is a lot of potential in low kicks, but for sure, like it is in a bit of an awkward state right now. But I think the innovation is absolutely there. I remember seeing a few heavy duty boot sets
Yep.
in SPL already. I think
Oh,
there might
maybe
be even but yeah, yeah. I've seen it a few times. I think from
okay.
like the many replays I've seen. So
Okay. Um, other Roaring Moon thoughts? CERN, did you have any other points on Devil's Advocate, why it might be appropriate? I think Petulant, especially foul play Petulant, is a really good point in Roaring Moon's favor, being a very solid check, especially with Terra, given that Roaring Moon is dependent on Terra. The only problem with that is foul play Petulant is meant to check these things like Terra Ogrepon Wellspring and Terra SD Gliscor, but we've seen examples in SPL where, I really wish I remembered the game, but I think it was Asif versus someone where Asif was fighting a stall team with SD Gliscor and just folded immediately to SD Gliscor. That may seem irrelevant to Roaring Moon, but the point is that this counterplay that we're being forced to run, forced to find a niche for in Roaring Moon's presence, is hurting the ability of teams to adapt to other physically offensive threats.
Yeah, and I think that goes back as well to a lot of toward the idea of reducing offensive saturation. I think there's a lot of Pokemon in this tier that can just be really difficult to effectively reply to in general, and I think that's where Pokemon like Pesharunt really excel in a healthy way, where they're able to just blanket check these really scary setup Pokemon. But it's absolutely true that it's much harder to check things like SD Gliscor and SD like Ogrepon Wellspring after a while, especially when you have to, especially if you're running Terra Pesharunt, you have to eat a really dangerous hit that's going to really render you down, potentially even stripping your boots if you end up getting forced out. That'll just have things take, have a hazard chip even accrue, and it could just make checking things like those Sword Stance Pokemon harder in the long run. And in a way, while you can, in theory, check that thing, there is a lot of different threats to account for that, having these flashable checks, they get overwhelmed after a while, unfortunately.
Yes. Yes, they're splashable, but they're not the most durable. Something we haven't quite mentioned in the Roaring Moon discussion is that it's a very booster-reliant Pokemon. I know Ausma pitched some Covert Cloak and CERN mentioned Lumberry at one point. Those are definitely lesser seen items and definitely worse, in my opinion. And speaking of splashable checks to offensive threats, one of the boogeymen of early SPL was Red Card Ting-Lu. That is a really strong adaptation to Roaring Moon sets. You either red card it out or whirlwind it out, and it's severely limited in its capacity to break a team or win against a team when Ting-Lu forces out in this way. The only problem is that's a one-time use item. and yes, Ting-Lu has other sets but those are more for bulky offense and balance. On the true offense teams, you usually see helmet and red card.
Yeah, I think one again, devil's advocate mode. One factor that makes Roaring Moon very balanced is the one-time nature of booster energy. It's been mentioned, of course, in this talk already that Roaring Moon can be both a wall breaker and a sweeper, but usually not both at the same time. If you're using it to wall break and you've got off the strong knockoff on the Corviknight, and now ideally your taunt or maybe you're switching into something that can take advantage of it, there's your booster energy gone. Unless you're willing to blow your Terra really early and try and capitalize on that situation from there to try and sweep like the whole team, it's rare that that happens. And you have to accept that Roaring Moon is not likely to sweep later on in the game if you've already used up your booster energy. So if you use it early, you're kind of just accepting it's going to be a wall breaker. You get the knockoff, you do what damage you can, whatever, you can use it as sack later. But if you want to try and sweep with it, then you have to save it. You don't want it to come out until it's really ready to go. I guess one other point that we touched on is that Roaring Moon is a bit of a Terra hog. Although I feel like you always want some Terra hog on your teams because part of playing Gen 9 is using Terra effectively, and Terra hogs are hogs because they use Terra effectively. Now, of course, an offense team often has a lot of potential Terra hogs, so you have to navigate your matchup and decide each game which Pokemon is most likely to use Terra most effectively. And Roaring Moon is just often going to be one of those Pokemon because it's really, really good at using Terra. So while
Absolutely.
yes, it is a Terra Hog, and you do have to build around that consideration, that's not a super compelling argument to keep it in the tier for me.
I'm gonna in reference to Roaring Moon's capacity as a Terra hog or rather a Terra abuser. I just wanted to shill for one of my mentors in the tier really quickly. He doesn't play very much anymore, but NJNP, previous council member,
I love that guy.
yeah, great person, instrumental in helping me become a better player for sure, and helped me understand Terra dynamics in this tier, which was really foreign to everybody at the time. But he was very ahead of the curve in terms of understanding that in team building, you really need to have Pokemon, at least on offense, but also in balanced teams and stall teams. That's harder to see immediately. That force Terra on the opponent's side. And that's a similar concept to initiative in older gens, but Terra is a resource that you really that's intrinsically tied to the pressure that your opponent is feeling. And you always want to be using your Terra to a greater advantage, to wield a greater advantage than your opponent uses their Terra. And Roaring Moon, we talked about already, is a great Terra abuser.
Yeah, that's a very strong point for sure. And it almost even like if it's using it reactively, I feel like it's almost always able to convert it into an advantage in some way, which is how easy it is to really find Dragon Dance opportunities.
For sure, especially with Terra Fairy, which turns, weaknesses and resistances, or sorry, weaknesses into resistances and immunities. Pokemon is very good. No one's arguing that it isn't. At the end of the day, there are three voices on this cast that are more or less in agreement that the thing has gotten a little too dangerous for our current tools to deal with it.
I do think I do sympathize with some of the do not ban arguments, but in a way I also don't think in a way I feel like also some of them don't fully offset the actual potential of Roaring Moon as well, especially the set variance. I feel like the set variance is probably the thing that really breaks it for me personally. And I do think Terra Blast is a major arbiter for that. But I mean, it even goes beyond Dragon Dance, to be honest. I think I mentioned even some like offsets that don't even use Dragon Dance. And while they're obviously nowhere near as potent, I do think they add of extra layers to account for with Roaring Moon because they can excel in different kinds of matchups. Like for example, a set that I don't think people really even run that much, but I think is disgustingly underrated is like a Roost like heavy duty boot set
Mhm.
that really works well with Future Sight.
Yeah.
Excels really well into fatter teams, a little, but struggles a little bit more into offense, which is a bit of an inversion of what you'd sort of like expect for something of like of Roaring Moon's ilk. But even then, it excels into fat with Dragon Dance because of like booster energy and how strong its knockoff is. It's just so many. There's just so many layers involved with Roaring Moon that I just think with how much it's capable of doing and how difficult it is to really account for that without some kind of deficit to your team and how you manage your resources. It's a very difficult Pokemon for the tier to deal with, I think, and
Absolutely.
I think it is overall a good idea just to really get rid of it.
Yeah. I before we go, I just wanted to shout out someone who I think you were shouting out low key in your mention of Boots Roaring Moon, but I wanted to shout out Lily, who has done incredibly this SPL, and she's the one that introduced me during SCL actually to this idea of non-DD at least, usually Boots Roaring Moon with Taunt and Roost, or some combination of those moves. Um,
She's been very on mark with the tier for a very long time, and to see her do well in SPL on top of that is definitely very refreshing to see. And though it's definitely crazy to see her get sold for only 8,000, like the return on investment there is
That was a steal.
absolutely insane.
mhm. I talk with Finch and Lily a lot, and Finch Finch's reaction to me getting bought for more than Lily is something that we make fun of him for a lot, very often, actually. But